So I'm very pleased to welcome today to the NatCon Australia podcast, Dr. Samuel Gregg. Dr. Gregg is the Friedrich Hayek Chair in Economics and Economic History at the American Institute for Economic Research. He's a PhD in Moral Philosophy and Political Economy from the University of Oxford, where he worked under the supervision of Professor John Finnis, another academically distinguished Australian, who was a long-time professor of law and legal philosophy there. Sam has written and spoken extensively on questions of political economy, economic history, monetary theory and policy, and natural law theory. He's the author of 16 books. His most recent book is The Next American Economy, Nation State, Markets in an Uncertain World. Very pleased to have you on the podcast, Sam. I've known about you for, as we were discussing offline, for many years. We have mutual friends that we formed, I guess, through the free market think tank world. I've, like many over the last couple of years, have gone through a bit of a reassessment about some of the positions that I held. But I think it's always really good to engage with people who, very learned people who understand what's going on and can talk about it in a very fluid and principled way. The first question I wanted to ask you, which I think is would be very useful for an Australian audience, is to describe the lay of the land. I mean, how has the bipartisan consensus on trade changed since 2016 in Washington, D.C.?
Well, thanks, Dan. It's great to be with you, and hello to all the viewers. So the question you ask is something that I've obviously thought a lot about, because I think it dominates certainly center-right and even to a certain extent center-left politics in the United States these days. Because, as you know, really from the early 1990s up until, I would argue, around about the 2008 financial crisis, there was a broad consensus about trade liberalization being in the interests of the United States, that was present on the right, but also on parts of the left as well. So, for example, Bill Clinton was a pretty active of trade liberalization. Barack Obama was to a certain extent as well, and successive Republican presidents from Reagan onwards had a pretty free market approach when it came to international trade. Now, that changed in the mid 2010s, as you point out, around about 2016, 2015, you started to see a change. And part of that was to do with the emergence of Donald Trump on the right. And Donald Trump has long been a protectionist in terms of his view of international trade. You can go back a long way in his history and you discover that he's never been particularly enthusiastic about trade liberalization. And there were others in the Republican Party who also had long held skeptical views about free trade. Pat Buchanan is a very good someone like that. And remember, he basically destroyed George H.W. Bush's chances of re-election in 1992. And he was very much someone who was skeptical of trade liberalization. You also have on the left people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, who have expressed deep skepticism about trade liberalization. And what's interesting is that if you compare, for example, the standpoint of, say, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump on trade questions, for all their differences on other subjects, they're more or less in the same position when it comes to trade. Or if you take, for example, someone like Senator Marco Rubio from Florida, and compare him with Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts. Now, one is a conservative Republican, the other is a liberal Democrat. But when it comes to trade and when it comes to associated things like industrial policy, they're more or less on the same page. You can also see continuity between the Trump administration and the Biden administration when it comes to trade policy. I mean, Donald Trump certainly moved the United States away from its hitherto positive view of trade liberalization. And the Biden administration has not changed much when it comes to actual trade policy. So you've certainly seen a shift across the American political spectrum away from a free trade consensus towards, I wouldn't say it's a strong, robust protectionist position, but it's certainly not the case that one can assume that the United States going forward is going to be an advocate of trade liberalization, whether it's in terms of trade agreements with particular countries or through organizations like the World Trade Organization. So the ground has shifted immensely on that particular issue. And it's a consensus that now embraces more or less both parties.
And why do you think that ultimately is? Because it's not as though people who could make arguments necessarily gain political support if there wasn't an appetite for that, or if when they were listening to the arguments being made, that it didn't ring true for them personally. I mean, isn't this a case at some level where Donald Trump or whomever has sort of illuminated this vast sort of discontent with the current trade and other economic settings, and that explains a large part of it. And now the political consensus has realized, geez, it's not only politically popular, but maybe we do need to think about some of these priors that we've been taken for granted throughout the last, whatever, at least in the post-Cold War era.
Well, the first thing I think to note is that trade issues have long been a dividing point in the United States. And this goes back to the American founding. Throughout the 19th century, after slavery, tariffs were the single biggest issue that divided the country. And interestingly enough, during the second half of the 19th century, the Republican Party was the party of protection, and the Democratic Party was the party of free trade. And so you've seen oscillation. So my point is there's a long-term oscillation about trade policy that's existed in the United States for a long time. And what we're seeing now is in some respects a reiteration of this. We're going through another cycle argument about America's proper stance vis-a-vis the world regarding trade. So that's one thing. I think a second thing is obviously the rise of China has caused a lot of Americans across the political spectrum to start questioning some of the, you said priors, some of the assumptions that I think were informing much of the debate in the 1990s about trade. Because in the 1990s, I think politics was, to a certain extent in America, very much shaped by the axiom that liberal democracy and market economies were inevitable, and it was simply a question of how quickly different countries got there. This was more or less a thesis associated with people like Francis Fukuyama and his book, The End of History. I never bought into that argument. Now, I'm very much a free trader. I very much believe in trade liberalization, but I'm not an economic determinist. And I think that was driving a lot of political thinking in the United States in the 1990s, all the way at least through to the mid-2000s. Now, China, of course, has changed many people's thinking about this particular question, because China has become a geopolitical rival to the United States. Certainly since Xi became Communist Party Secretary General in 2012, China has adopted a much more belligerent stance vis-a-vis the rest of the world. So that's one factor. A second factor is the belief or the sense among many people in the United States, particularly in specific parts of the country, the Midwest, places like Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, etc., that many of these people in these states believe that they have been net losers from the process of globalization. They argue that if you look around the United States, you see factories that have closed. They argue that jobs have been outsourced to Canada, Mexico, China, etc. And that has been a source of disenchantment on the part of a good number of Americans with trade liberalization. Now, I could sit here and give you lots of arguments why I think that's a mistake. I could sit here and point out all sorts factoids that I think contradict that impression. But the fact is, that is what a lot of Americans believe about trade liberalization domestically. And that inevitably has implications for politics, because I think, particularly in America, legislators and even presidents tend to follow where they think the electorate is going. And if you look at opinion polling on this subject of trade in the United States, what you find, not surprisingly, is a lot of inconsistency, right? So if you ask Americans today, are you in favor of trade with other countries, you get a broad, generic yes. If China is introduced into the discussion, then people's opinions change very quickly. They shift away from a sort of generically favorable view of more trade with other countries to a more skeptical view of trade with other countries. It also depends on what part of the country you live in. People on the coasts and in the South tend to have a more positive view of trade than people living in the Midwest. So I think that's also part of the dynamic. But another part of the dynamic, which I think is true everywhere, not just in the United States, is that we've seen a lot of cultural changes happening in the United States and other countries, whereby many of the certainties that people once lived their lives by or simply took for granted have changed a lot. So, for example, when it comes to marriage rates are collapsing around the world. We're also seeing the birth rate go down. We have the phenomena in the United States. I don't know if this is the same in Australia, but in the United States, you have this phenomena of young, blue-collar, predominantly white men checking out of the workforce and really not working. So these unhealthy social and cultural developments, I think, are also part of what's driving the discussion about trade, because trade liberalization is the argument you often hear from people about why it is that some of these young white blue-collar men are not working. Now, I happen to think that's a mistaken argument. I think it's a mistaken diagnosis. But again, what matters is perception in many of these cases, and there is many people who perceive that the crisis of many different forms of social and cultural crises in the United States and elsewhere reflect some economic dynamics that have been going on for a long time. And I think that's also driving a lot of discussion and rethinking about trade in the United States and markets more generally, actually. I think it's not just trade that's now in question. You're seeing political parties in the United States and Europe, and maybe even in Australia as well, becoming a little bit more skeptical about the case for markets in general than they certainly were even 10 years ago.
Right. I mean, I remember distinctly China's entry into the WTO because I was in Shanghai at the time. I spent a large part of my early career there. And there's one conversation that I always remember and comes back to me increasingly in this context. We were sitting in downtown Shanghai catching up with a journalist friend of mine. I think she was working for CNN. And we were discussing, as everyone was, is China's entry into the WTO a good thing, blah, blah, blah. And of course, is newly minted ANU grads where, Adam Smith this, David Ricardo that, caught in the temper of the times, we were like, it will help aid democratization. Wasn't just us saying it, was all the luminaries, the Tony Blairs, the Bill Clintons and the rest of it.
Sure.
Or George W. Bush, all flat wrong in retrospect. But the guy beside us who'd come along to dinner was this older guy, the cameraman. And I said, politely, what do you think? And he said, I think it's going to be a disaster. And I was like, really? Where are you from? Oh, I'm from Ohio. and I've always thought of that in many contexts. It's always worth, don't assume don't assume or don't get caught up in the sort of ideological temper of the times. Always listen to guys who might actually have a real kind of some real world experience, a real world perspective on things. I mean, China is, as you said, it's a large factor in this in why people are no longer as positive in the United States and did Australia in relation to trade now. What should the trade and investment relationship be between the United States and China?
Well, that's a big question. So the first thing I'll do is mention that I recently had a white paper published on this very subject of trade and national security, because I think that's also the other factor that's underlying this, right? The fact that trade is very difficult to separate out from foreign policy. In fact, it's impossible. You can't separate these things out. And the assumption was, I think, as you point out, that trade liberalization, China coming into the WTO, would, quote unquote, make them more like us. And that obviously has not happened. One, because the Chinese Communist Party is absolutely determined never to let go of power. And so they'll do whatever it takes. They think they need to stay in power. So trade has not softened the regime. If anything, under Xi, I think the regime has got even nastier and tougher in many respects. So that's one part of the calculation that I think Americans have to make. A second thing that Americans need to think about is that trade with China in economic terms has certainly been a boon to the United States when it comes to lower prices, when it comes to availability of more goods and services, when it comes to increasing competitive pressures on the American economy, which I think is good because I think more competition leads to more productivity, et cetera, et cetera. So the challenge for the United States is, can you maintain a trade relationship with China that brings these various economic benefits, but also manage the national security side of things? And that is a really difficult thing to thread right now. One thing I do think that is important to bring into this discussion is we need to also look at what's happening in China and to ask ourselves whether China is going to be able to sustain itself as emerging as this great power in the Asia-Pacific region. Because I happen to think that China has some enormous internal problems. One, of course, is its demographic problem. The one-child policy has turned out to be a disaster, and that's going to mean a lot of spending on healthcare and pensions and aged care in the future, and a lot of resources going into that rather than into more productive parts of the economy. I also think that the centralization of power in China, which has gone on under Xi, is creating the typical types of problems that you find with these types of authoritarian regimes, insofar as the leadership is increasingly buffered off from reality, and that's going to, I think, cause some problems for them in the future. Corruption and cronyism is rife throughout society. They have a huge problem with their property market. The more that they bring more of the economy into the states, more control, that is having the usual inefficiencies associated with that. So that's another thing I think we need to think about, because on the one hand, if that's true, that China has these immense internal problems that are going to cause them immense difficulties going forward, then on the one hand, yes, okay, then maybe China isn't going to be the long-term threat that we imagine it to be. But on the other hand, we also know that states that perceive that they are entering into a period of decline start to behave in unpredictable and often erratic ways. So it's a very complicated thing. I mean, the other thing which is also interesting to me, I don't know if you've noticed this as well, but American and European businesses are leaving China. So if you're looking at things like the US-China Chamber of Commerce reports or the European China Chamber of Commerce reports, they're all stating that the number of businesses from these countries that are investing in China has dropped. Lots of these companies who have big outfits there are either scaling back their enterprises or closing them altogether and moving to other countries. And it's because the business environment in China is no longer as conducive as it was for foreign investors as it was, say, even 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. So when you look at all those factors, you start to say, okay, yes, we have to thread this very difficult path between genuine national security concerns and the trade benefits against a background of what is really going on in China. And that's going to be extremely difficult going forward. I mean, I'd like to think that Americans will be able to trade with Chinese companies and businesses and invest in China in ways that are beneficial for those companies. But I think the overall economic climate in China is shifting in such a way that fewer and fewer American businesses find China to be a good prospect for investment in the future, which means they're going to, if they want to do outside investment, they're going to need to look at other countries. And they're already starting to do this. They're moving operations to places like Vietnam, Malaysia, China, etc.
But so you, I mean, just to get down to sort of brass tacks, my understanding is that both presidential candidates are in, well, the Democrats at least are in favor of continuing, continuing the Biden tariffs, which is a continuation of the Trump tariffs. And Trump has, along with his potentially new USTR, Bob Lighthizer, are going to up them even further, and not only on China, but a sort of much more broad-based tariff regime is going to be introduced into the United States. Is that what's your understanding of the two different proposals? I mean, have you looked at them in depth? Yeah.
Yes, in fact, I have. It's part of my job is to look at some of these things. So the Trump administration, a future Trump administration, is proposing to basically raise tariffs by 10% on all goods coming into the United States, and to slap 60% tariffs on Chinese goods entering into the United States. So you have to ask yourself how much of that is just electoral posturing. We're at a period now where both sides are engaging in a lot of posturing, and how much of that is real. So Robert Lighthizer, I think, who was Trump's trade representative in Trump's first administration, made it very clear that he wanted to see a change in policy towards China. And you may know that in part of the Trump administration's policies towards China was to slap tariffs on aluminium and steel. Those tariffs didn't work. They didn't achieve the objectives that they had set out to achieve. And we know this because President Trump's Council of Economic Advisors actually say it in their 2019 report to the president on pages 502 to 504. They say that the tariffs on China didn't work. It produced retaliation from China that particularly affected American farmers. And it also produced blowback from other countries as well, including allies of the United States. So if the Trump administration, if a Trump administration is elected in November this year, and they get their way on trade and they go down the path that they say they're going to go down, then I think we'll find not just a US-China trade war emerging, but as you know, the effects of tariffs are very difficult to confine to just one country, to have spillover effects. So I think if a Trump administration is elected, then I think we'll enter a period of economic nationalism is what I would see emerging. If Kamala Harris is elected president, it won't necessarily be trade wars on the scale that would presumably happen as a consequence of Trump's preferred policies. But I think you'd see still a lot of trade tensions between America and the rest of the world. So, for example, the Biden administration has just nixed a trade agreement with Vietnam. Now, Vietnam is not a friend of China, as I'm sure you know, that there's a long rivalry between those two countries. A lot of American companies were shifting their operations from China to Vietnam because the business climate in Vietnam was a lot better. But the deal that was being set up between America and Vietnam has just been nixed by the Biden administration. So however we go forward, whoever is elected, we're going to see I think, considerable turmoil on the trade front that won't just be limited to relations between America and China. It will affect relations between America and the rest of the world.
Yeah, you can get people who are notionally free traders to accept the idea that, China is a sui generis case, and that particular trade measures need to be imposed on it because of the nature of its political regime. And then there are others who think, well, it's not just China. What China illustrates is an example of why the theory overall is flawed. At the very least, free trade is contingent on political, geopolitical circumstances. Vietnam also doesn't rate very highly up in terms of political liberties and everything else, right, even though it's different to China in some ways. It also has a very industrious, they're industrious people. It's still lower labor costs than the United States. And it hasn't, Pat Buchanan and those guys who made their critiques in the early 90s, they were more worried at the time, not so much about China, but Mexico, right? And NAFTA,
yes,
that was the one that really got political traction at the time. Now, Mexico is not China. It doesn't pose the same sort of geopolitical threats. The issue has been more that it's a big pool of cheap labor that has, created in Ross Perot's word, this giant sucking jobs and everything down there. And China, when it came into the world economy full way after the WTO entry, it created an even bigger, it dumped an incredible cheap labor pool on the world. And I guess my question is, you can get people to talk the security side and different measures that are required. In Australia, I think that's where people are at a little bit. We're not changing our free trade regime. The trade arrangements that Tony Abbott signed, you can get people to grumble about them, but it's still going to be zero tariffs effectively on manufactured goods coming into Australia. I see no change of that at the moment here, unlike the United States. But you can nevertheless get people to talk about particular industries like critical minerals, or we'll build up our, military and buy American subs, or get into quantum computing and all variety of different things. But my question is, isn't it at some level? Didn't we move in the post-Cold War world a little bit too fast, too soon, at the very least, and wasn't it unfair, to the industrial Midwest and other parts of the Western world that had these industrial centers, because effectively what you were doing is just allowing business to outsource those operations to take advantage of the cheap labor in third world countries. There was a line from a piece in the Atlantic, and it referred to an anonymous hedge fund executive, and he said, if the transformation of the world economy lifts 4 people in China and India out of poverty and into the middle class, and meanwhile that means 1 American drops out of the middle class, that's not such a bad trade. What do you think? Is that a trade that we should have made?
Well, the first thing I would say is, I suppose I would question the anonymous hedge fund executive's assessment. Why do I say that? Well, first of all, if you look, let's just talk about the United States and American, particularly manufacturing. That's the issue that gets on a lot of people's mind. What happened with manufacturing? Well, manufacturing in the United States is still incredibly productive. America is still, by all these different ratings, either the first or the second or the third top manufacturing country in the world. So that's one thing that's going on. Now, the number of people working in manufacturing has declined considerably. So I think the peak was something like 19 million people in 1972. Now it's about 12 million or something like that. And so you have to say, well, what are the causes for this? Now, one of the arguments you often hear is this is a question of outsourcing, etc. But if you look at good empirical studies of what's happened to manufacturing in the United States, what you quickly discover is that something between 80 to 90% of the decline of employment in US manufacturing is primarily due to technology. So if you go into a manufacturing plant in the United States today, you won't see sort of burly men, sort of circa 1950s, using hard physical labor to put things together. You're much more likely to see a lot of computers, a lot of robots, and a lot of people walking around in lab coats. So the nature of manufacturing has changed, particularly on the technological side. And I think that, well, the empirical studies that I've looked at suggest that that is by far the biggest contributor to the decline of manufacturing employment. So that's one thing. So that sort of raises questions about the anonymous hedge fund executives understanding what's happened. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is that something like 2/3 of American towns that were once manufacturing hubs certainly went through a significant transformation from the 1970s onwards. And that was not easy. It was difficult. And there was certainly a human cost to that. But it's also true that, as I said, 2/3 of the towns have transformed themselves. They've moved from being, say, manufacturing hubs to combinations of technology, healthcare, etc. So what I'm saying is there's another story that I think is often missed when we're trying to explain what has happened with manufacturing in Western countries. And I'd also mention that more and more economies have shifted towards the service sector. And that's a trend that's going on across the world. It doesn't mean that manufacturing is less productive. If anything, manufacturing is more productive. It just means that people are working in different types of industries. And that's the story of economic transformation, I think, that's been going on since the emergence of modern capitalism, since the beginning of the 19th century. Now, again, I'm not denying that there are trade-offs. I'm not denying that that can be difficult. If you're a 55-year-old steel worker and suddenly the factory closes, it's not so easy for that person to sort of get up and, I don't know, transform themselves into a .com
learn to code
business.
Yeah.
Right. So, and I think that Trump was actually very clever in the way that he didn't use language like that. And I think that was a mistake that some free marketers made. They underestimated how difficult the transformation would be for some people. In fact, I think some were relatively cavalier about that. But at the same time, there is these other sets of facts, which I don't think are sufficiently part of the conversation if we're trying to understand what's happened with manufacturing. We also need to remember that in the case of the United States, yes, manufacturing has declined as a proportion of overall employment, but overall employment has increased massively since the 1970s. We have one of the lowest unemployment rates in American history right now. We also have something like 500,000 manufacturing jobs that can't be filled because people don't necessarily have the skills that they're necessary for these types of jobs. So yes, there has been these transformations. Yes, they have had some social impact. But I still would argue that in the long term, these policies were beneficial for America, Americans, and that to think that you can shield yourself off from what's going on in other parts of the world, if other people want to work harder, if they want to be more competitive, tariffs can stave that off for a while. But I think certainly in the case, for example, of Australia, we know that that's a dead-end story eventually.
But okay, I mean, so in your view then, should it matter whether America has an auto industry? Because I remember, I mentioned this, I guess, on a previous podcast, but I remember a lunch that Peter Costello was at, an Australia Day lunch in Hong Kong, where this is like 2008, I think, where he said, look, I hear these American guys, congressmen, and they say to me, we're worried China's going to steal our auto industry, and they don't understand, it's comparative advantage and all sort of stuff. And I just remember thinking at that stage too, it kind of does matter at some point whether China produces all America's automobiles. I mean, that's you need to. Yes, oh look, what is manufacturing? Some of the papers and stuff I've read, it can depend precisely how you define that term.
Mm-hmm.
But at some level, and this goes back, all the way back to Alexander Hamilton and Abraham Lincoln and all of the post-Civil War Republican leaders who were very clear that America can't just be a kind of big agricultural and nation sending goods off to industrialized Europe. We need to have our own we need to become an industrial power. We need to become a manufacturing power. It did become a manufacturing power post-Civil War, the world's greatest manufacturing power. And people, and I'm sure you'll make this argument too, would say, oh, well, they became like that in spite of, not because of the very high tariff regime that was implemented.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, China also became a manufacturing superpower behind a serious tariff wall as well. I mean, there's plenty of Australia had a manufacturing sector that it sustained from 1900 until the 1970s behind a tariff wall. I mentioned earlier the last conversation I had was with the former Premier of Queensland, Campbell Newman, who grew up in Launceston. I understand you're from there, right?
Right.
So Launceston today is a different town than it was in the 1970s, but it's not an industrial town anymore. It's a sort of bucolic town, and you can see the old factories. And in many ways, it's very pleasant. But I venture to guess that the proportion of people in Launceston today who either work directly or indirectly for the government or receive some type of government welfare is so much higher than it was in the 1970s. So is that really, and obviously, everything they consume at the local sort of Kmart has been produced in China, more or less. Is that really beneficial and sustainable long term?
Yeah. So this is the picture you're describing is a very prevalent one. It's one that I think has exerted a lot of influence on political and public policy debate for a while now. And I think the point that you just made about the number of people who are now on welfare or receiving some form of benefit or entitlement from the government, that has certainly risen in most Western countries. Now, it's partly because of the aging of the population, but it's also because there are large numbers of people who are not fitted up, so to speak, who don't necessarily have the skills for the type of new jobs that are available or might be available, etc. So there's no question that has happened, and you see this particularly in the United States, where there's I think we mentioned before, young white blue collar men who have worked out that if they put enough benefits together, they can live relatively comfortably, right? And this is a trend that's been going on since the 1960s in the United States. So it's not something that's just happened recently. It's something that's been going on for a while. So yes, this is definitely a problem. And the question you have to ask is that what is it that is causing people or even entire regions or cities not to adapt? And one of the things that's certainly the case in the United States is that part of the problem in terms of failure to adapt or failure to change or inability to change is that if a part of the country or city decides to opt for industrial policy or subsidies or whatever it happens to be, that just encourages an unsustainable status quo. So, for example, in the United States, the most notorious example is a town called Youngstown, which is in Ohio. And this is a town...
Song, the famous Bruce Springsteen song.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And what's interesting about that town is, whereas I mentioned before, most former manufacturing towns have undergone some form of transformation. And again, I'm not downplaying that was a difficult process. But places like Youngstown, Ohio, opted for subsidies, opted for the government, opted for lobbying by their congressmen for funds to be sent to sustain whatever happened to be the local manufacturing plant. And guess what? It didn't improve employment. It didn't change the often very difficult social and cultural problems in these places. It increased the degree of reliance upon government, etc. So my point is that if you think government subsidies are part of the solution, I think that's a mistake, because I think they're actually part of the problem.
Isn't it? What's wrong with the sort of Calvin Coolidge type regime where you had high tariffs, but you had a very liberal, libertarianish regime within the country? I think John Derbyshire, the author, talks about, libertarianism in one country, like on the old Soviet line with socialism in one country. And so there's a difference, isn't there, between, look, the critique that's being made at the moment is different to sort of the Keynesian critique in the 1970s. It's been made on the people from the kind of conservative right in many cases, who are saying something slightly different, right? They're saying, what's wrong with that a nation isn't just an economic zone. It has responsibilities to its own citizens, that it shouldn't be the case that an individual has to compete directly, his labor has to compete directly with a person in Vietnam or a person in a low-wage jurisdiction. And so what's wrong with some sort of basic kind of protective wall, not an absolute wall, but something which equalizes the labor protections and the environment and the market we've built up in Australia and the United States? Isn't it a little bit of it's unfair to say, we've built up this labor, this affluent market with all these protections and everything else. You can just import your products duty-free. But if you're in the United States or in Australia, you're subject to all these other taxes, fringe benefits tax in Australia, capital gains tax, all the rest, all these other taxes that have actually grown up since the 80s that directly impact on people, including income tax and all the rest of it too, which is percentage in average weekly earnings terms actually higher now than it was in the 80s. So isn't it the worst of all possible worlds you're creating in these developed jurisdictions like Australia? You're creating this red zone where businesses that stay there are taxed and regulated to death. But if you get out of the red zone and go to Vietnam or anything else, you can send your goods back into Australia duty free. I mean, isn't that?
So there's a couple of things.
Yeah.
So there's a few things going on there. So one of my critiques of a lot of, let's call them economic nationalists, right? So economic nationalists in the United, or wherever they're from, is that they seem to think that the government and government intervention, whether it's through tariffs or industrial policy or lots and lots of regulation, complicated tax codes, etc., that somehow you can preserve a type of America or a type of Australia from the pressures of international competition. And one of my critiques is, well, all those policies that you've just proposed, whether it's regulation, tariffs, industrial policy, etc., we know that these sap the economic competitiveness and growth capacities of a given economy. So if I had to choose between a high tariff regime and lots and lots of internal liberalization in the United States, I might be willing to do that, because I would argue that maybe if we made the economy as competitive as possible, offset the negative effects of the tariffs. And that, I think, is part of, you mentioned people like Republican administrations in the second half of the 19th century in America. And I think it's fair to say that one of the reasons why the American economy grew so quickly was internally, it was actually extremely free. Relatively little regulation, strong property rights, strong rule of law, strong protections for contracts, all these sorts of things, all of which I think have been significantly corroded and undermined in the United States for a long time now. So if we could get back to that, to a sort of Coolidge-like America, then I'd be willing to say, okay, maybe if paying tariffs is the price for that, then maybe that might be a trade-off worth considering. Now, in the United States, because it's such a big economy, such a big and dynamic economy, even despite all the regulation and seriously messed up tax codes and things like that, that's what keeps the American economy powering along, right? But I'm not sure in the case of smaller countries like Australia, whether that's necessarily, that sort of trade-off is actually going to work, because I don't think a country like Australia, or small countries, by that I mean population size, relatively small, I'm not sure they have the option of getting into the protectionist settings, because they're so dependent upon imports as well as exports. America, compared to a lot of other countries, its trade with the rest of the world is actually relatively low as a percentage of the overall economy. But we also know that in the long term, tariffs tend to, first of all, encourage a certain lack of competition, in particular, those particular segments of the economy that it's applied to. And we know in the United States that the second half of the 19th century, the most inefficient and the least productive industries were those that enjoyed a high tariff compared to everyone else. I also think that another problem with the protectionist regimes is that they breed cronyism. Because if you look behind most tariffs, what do you discover? A lobby group, a lobby group that. Go ahead.
Yeah, they can be done well and done poorly. And they can, like you say, Australia would need to team up just to a certain extent with other countries that are similar. And there's, it's not as though there's this one solution which we can fit neatly on top of, and that will apply forever and a day, and in every period, and with every different nation, different nations trading relationships with different other nations, will vary. And I just, I mean, and Australia is in a somewhat unique situation, because particularly with respect to China, we have a big trade surplus, whereas the United States and others, and we sort of tend to forget that. We've been deindustrialized probably at least as much as everywhere else, but we've received this boon because of our minerals riches, and that's certainly had, has it made us richer? It has at some level, but we seem to have this massive, big, trade deficit. I mean, I think, again, the idea that you can have the ideal, right, the Calvin Coolidge ideal, that you can have a high tariff wall but a very free internal labor market. I mean, that seems an attractive one to me in some sense, because it's certainly preferable to the current situation, where you are absolutely slammed with taxes and regulations internally. There does seem to be a relationship between, for example, this is what I love to tell my libertarian friends. The first peacetime income tax in the United States was introduced by Woodrow Wilson, but he was the one who started to cut dramatically the Republican era, tariff regime. Gough Whitlam was the first one who dramatically cut tariffs in Australia, but
25%.
Exactly. Well, I think it was 30, but or maybe higher. It impacted a place like Launceston, but he upped the other type of taxes. Hawke Keating, that yes, they cut tariffs further, but they introduced capital gains tax, fringe benefits tax, income taxes, all the rest of it. So So it seems like there's a trade-off at another level. Even good old Robert Peel of the Corn Laws days, he was the guy who first introduced a peacetime income tax into the United Kingdom, right? So I'm not saying it's perfect, that trade-off, but it does seem they got to get their tax from somewhere, and if they can't get it from the customs duty, they'll start to hone in on their own people. the analogy also isn't perfect, but we've created a platform like, say, like an Apple app platform, right? And now Apple charges people who want to get onto their platform to play and make money from consumers that it uses on their platform. Isn't that somewhat similar to what the Calvin Coolidge ideal? You establish this well-run market, you look after your workers, protect them with reasonable, or at least there's a debate between capital and labor as to what is reasonable. But you keep it a very free market internally. You should be able to trade from goods between Townsville and Launceston and Perth freely, in the same way that you can send goods between Chicago and Florida and the rest of it freely. No barriers internally, but we protect that market at some level by a tax on goods crossing a border, because people are producing them in other jurisdictions with not the same type of protections or well-run. And that is what those guys, Republicans of the post-Civil War era, was saying, right? They were saying we're not going to compete directly with, at that stage, cheap European labor. We want to, otherwise, it'll just be a race to the bottom in labor costs. We need to create a property-owning democracy, a republic, and have buy-in across the board. You need to be able to have people with a high, maintain high labor costs in Australia and the United States. And Australia similarly could have, in the 1900s, and there was pressure by the business people to say, look, we'll just import all this, we don't need tariffs, we'll import goods from Asia, or we'll have much more cheaper third world labor come and develop the north. And the north of Australia would have developed more quickly if different policy regime had been in place. But the trade-off was made, no, in order to maintain this sort of property-owning democracy, we need to have this particular type of protective regime in place. Isn't that a bit like, I think in the 1980s, it's a bit like Chesterton's fence, right? They didn't quite understand why the fence was there, and so they just dismantled it without a proper explanation of why it actually existed in the first place.
Well, so there's a lot there. So no, that's okay. This is good. So I remember, I'm older. I was basically a teenager when in the 1980s, and growing up in Australia. And I was always very interested in these questions. And I actually thought that one of the things that Hawke and Keating were pretty good at doing was explaining why what the journalist Paul Kelly called the Australian settlement, right? Why that was no longer sustainable. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I've got the same book. I think it's a very good analysis of the changes. It's the outstanding analysis, I think, of the changes in Australia. And one of the points that Kelly makes, and others have made the same point as well, is that Hawke and Keating were exceptionally good at explaining to often their blue collar constituencies why these changes were necessary, why the tariff war had to be dismantled. What was it? Keating's line was always, we're ring fenced with tariffs, and we simply can't keep going this way because it's making us less competitive, etc. And he was also very good at explaining that this in the long term is going to be in the country's benefits if we're talking about things like increasing wealth, etc. So I actually think that they were able to change a lot of the conversation, and it's very difficult, as you know, to change the political consensus about a given position, because protectionism was more or less the consensus position for really since Deakin, right? Since Deakin up until the 1980s. Well, yeah, right, to Whitlam, and the well, it used to be called the Country Party had a lot to do with that, right? Because they didn't want competition coming in from the outside. But this, of course, meant that so much of the Australian economy was becoming uncompetitive. And in a case like Australia, that's really problematic because the country is so isolated from the rest of the world. So I think that's part of the dynamic. Now, we've talked about, in the case of the United States, because it is such a big economy, it's 25% of the world's GDP. The impact of protectionism is not as great as it is in smaller countries, smaller, more isolated, less populated countries. But nonetheless, it did have some very negative effects. In the 19th century, as I mentioned, the least competitive, the least productive industries in the United States were those that were subject to the tariff. It produced a lot of cronyism. It facilitated a lot of very negative lobbying. There's a book written by Frank Townsend, who was a late 19th century economist, and it's called A History of US Tariffs. And he points out that when you look at the tariff regime that's constructed at any one point in time, it's very rare that it's actually driven by a sort of inner economic logic. It's much more driven by who has the most influence with politicians and congressmen. So if you're interested in, I think, in significantly winding back that type of corrupting influence, and this is one of the arguments, of course, that Adam Smith made about the mercantile system, was that it was inherently corrupting to the body politic. So as I said, if one could get back to a type of Coolidge-like set of arrangements in the United States, which at the moment I don't foresee, because both parties seem very much more inclined to intervention in the economy than either parties were even 10 years ago. That might be a trade-off that's worth it. But at the moment, I think that's not going to happen. But I do think in the long term that protectionism does cause these deeper long-term problems. And once they're in place, they're really difficult to remove. There's a lot of political capital that has to be invested in removing them. So I think economically, the case for protectionism and tariffs is very weak. Politically, I think there are some significant problems. I also think that in the long term, they're just not particularly effective at dealing with the fact that we live in a relatively globalized economy where people are going to be competitive. They are going to seek their comparative advantage. And there's not much we can do to dissuade them from doing that. So that means that, I mean, this is the political challenge, right? The political challenge is if you're a free marketer like me or a free trader like me, you've got to basically be willing to say, look, they're living in a competitive, dynamic market that's open to the rest of the world is not easy. It can be very, very demanding on the psyche of the body politic, and you have to ask yourself whether the trade-off is worth it in the long term. I happen to think it is, but I quite understand why there are people who have a different view to me on this particular subject.
The trade stuff is interesting, and it's sort of the most concrete element of it all. But the critique that's come out and it's developed since 2016 and Trump's sort of surprising victory is now a bit more substantial and, dare I say it, philosophical, right? There is, and it covers other areas like immigration and foreign policy. But given your background, I just thought it would be interesting having a discussion about, let's call it the post-liberalism critique of the existing or the prior consensus. What's your view on liberalism generally?
Yeah, that's a good question because I think the word liberalism means very, very different things to people, right? So in America, when you hear the word liberal, what it typically means is New Deal, Roosevelt, LBJ, Great Society, lots of interventionism in the economy. And on the social, liberalism means, social permissiveness, live and let live attitudes towards any number of cultural issues. One might have a certain degree of relativism about moral questions, etc. So that's what liberalism means in the United States.
Mm.
Liberalism in the context of 19th century Britain meant something very different. It meant free trade. That was one of the big things. You mentioned Robert Peel. Free trade was part of it. But there was also this sense that you needed a type of moral and cultural order within which markets would operate. And there's a very strong tradition of that. Someone like Friedrich Hayek more or less held to that type of position, very much a free market person, obviously, right? But he also said things like, quote unquote, a free society is paradoxically enough likely to be also a very traditional society. So that's a type of Burkean view of what you might call liberalism. And I always like to say to people, you know, Burke is often seen as the progenitor of modern conservatism. But people forget that Burke was also a Whig, exactly, a WHIG, and was also very much a free market guy, very, very committed to economic liberty. So, I mean, I often like to call myself a Burkean Whig. It's on my Twitter handle, a Burkean Whig, because I think that's if you describe yourself as a liberal in that sort of classical sense, then that I think is what I'm happy to sort of sign up to that. But you know, there are other classical liberals who have very different views to me, for example, on cultural and social questions, for example.
Yeah. Can't liberalism be quite a destructive philosophy in this sense? And this is something that Yoram Hazony and others, and Patrick Janine and other points have made. It's sort of, it's animating kind of direction is to break through barriers, break through definitions, break through traditional kind of institutions. That's what feeds it, right? And so it doesn't like trade borders in the same way it doesn't like definitions of marriage or traditional definitions of marriage. It doesn't like definitions of gender. I think I read an article from yours and you said, you know, to claim there is a more or less straight line between Locke and drag queen hour at the local children's library is rather a stretch.
Right.
I take your point, but there is a species of liberalism which doesn't like any boundaries on individual freedom and subjectivity, and there is a link there between the two of them, right? Individual autonomy above everything else, and whatever limits are imposed on me by the state are an infringement of that, and I'm a liberal. What do you say to that?
Well, I would say that's not the type of classical liberal I am. As I mentioned, I'm very much a sort of Burkean Whig type. And I think that type of liberalism, which you find on the left, and you also find it on parts of the right. The long-term problem with that is that I think free societies need certain reference points if they're going to remain free. I also think that things like human nature don't change. And by that, I mean certain features of the way we act, the way we think, the role of self-interest, the fact that we have limited knowledge, all these sorts of things which people like Hayek talked a great deal about. But I also believe in natural law. I believe there is a natural law. I think we can know it. I think it has implications for how we think about the role of government and the state and the economy and these sorts of things.
That's your answer. That's your answer, right? That's what I sort of gathered from your articles. You think that natural law is the check on this ever-expanding, no limits on what I should be able to do liberalism.
Yes, and it ties back to a sort of deeper understanding of what you think the human person is. And I think human persons are much more than just bundles of emotions and desires. That we can know truth, we can know that there are certain goods that fulfill us as people at all times in all places, and that minus those things, you end up in a type of highly relativistic set of cultural arrangements. And what do people do when that happens? Well, generally they start looking for someone to bring order to the situation, right? And that often takes the form of excessive excessive government intervention into all sorts of segments of life. But also what I would argue is, what Benedict XVI called the dictatorship of relativism, whereby the government becomes the enforcer of the idea that there are no truths, there are no moral truths, and anyone who questions that is seen as a threat to the social order. So when it comes to these sort of debates about post-liberalism and liberalism, again, I think a lot depends on what one means by liberalism. It means recognizing that there are different traditions of liberalism. And the one that I'm arguing, I think, is actually pretty consistent with, I think, the best impulses of Western civilization.
But so it's still anchored to these cultural artifacts that actually sit outside, in a way, the liberal axioms, which are, well, you could say, are products of that, right? And I think Deneen and other people have sort of said that what the liberalism does is it lives parasitically off the pre-liberal moral order. It uses that cultural capitalism, but ultimately kind of degrades and destroys it. I mean, that rings true to me because it does, and I understand what you're saying. There's a sort of more, in theory at least, a much more kind of healthy type of liberalism, which doesn't dispense with those guardrails and those anchors. But, you survey the scene over the last 30 years, and it does seem as though, there just has been this sort of corrosion of all those traditional type of institutions in the name of freedom and in the name of liberalism broadly defined. And, liberty is one thing, but liberalism as an ideology doesn't seem to be able to check itself.
Yeah, and again, I think it comes back to what one means by these types of things. So I think, what you're in part talking about is the breakdown of what was a relatively widespread moral consensus that was adhered to by people from a range of different backgrounds and positions, so that in the context of 19th century Britain or 19th century, or even up until really the 1960s in the United States, there was a sort of broad consensus that there are certain truths that transcend time and place and circumstance, etc. So I think that has certainly broken down. There's no question about that. Now, the question is then, what is driving that? Now, the part of the answer of people like Patrick Deneen and Yoram Hazony is that this is something to do with the inner logic, if you like, of liberalism. I would have a different take. I would say that it has something to do with a breakdown of broad consensus about natural law. I would say it has something to do with the breakdown of religion as a sort of reference point in a lot of people's lives. Now, the question is, okay, is this the result of liberalism? Well, I mean, I look at the 1960s and I see a lot of the cultural deconstruction going on there as not so much coming from liberals, but from cultural Marxists for the most part. If you look at so think about, for example, 1968, that's the year that we all look at and say, okay, something fundamentally changed. And it doesn't seem to me that it was liberals arguing for those things. It was a fair degree of agitation coming from the left of the political spectrum, a lot of it Marxist, neo-Marxist, cultural Marxist, a lot of French neo-Marxists, etc. And I think that is where you can find, if I was going to attribute blame for the breakdown of these things, which I think are very necessary if you're going to have a free society, I think that's where you would attribute most of the blame. I don't think this is coming from Locke. I don't think this is coming from Hayek, or even the vast majority of classical liberals in the 20th century. I think this is coming from other sources that regard liberalism broadly construed as a problem that needs to be dispensed with. So that is, I guess, how I would argue that the cause of these problems, which I think are real problems, I don't attribute it to liberalism per se. I think it's coming from other ideological sources which make no bones about what they're trying to do. Now, you can identify particular liberal thinkers who I think have contributed to that. I think John Stuart Mill certainly contributed to some of this stuff, because if you read a lot of his correspondence, the things he didn't say out loud, it's very clear that he had a particular agenda that was...
I think it was the 60s. He would have been marching.
Oh, absolutely. Very happy with that. But I think you can also look at other 19th century liberals like Tocqueville, Lord Acton, William Gladstone, Robert Peel, etc. And no, that is not what they're arguing for at all.
Yeah, I just wonder whether they loosen it enough. The liberals, broadly defined, come in and loosen these institutions, or to a certain point, and then you have the more Marxist or revolutionary elements that come in to sort of take advantage of the situation. It's an interesting. I mean, I think you can make a case in different historical periods, right?
Cause and effect is a really interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why I made that line about Locke the drag queen hour of the children's library. I just don't see the link, but I do see a link between 1968 and drag queen hour at the local children's library.
Got it. I've taken a lot of your time. It's an interesting conversation. Just sort of finish up with one, hopefully very brief one. Is America an idea?
You've been listening to J.D. Vance.
Well, I was thinking, is Australia an idea? Is Australia an idea as well? Are we just a nation's just a sort of bundle of liberal axioms?
Well,
or if they're more than that, then what can we say there, and what can we focus on preserving, and why?
So I do think America is different, and I say this as someone who came looking in from the outside, who has lived in America for a long time, but I still have, I think, a capacity to look at it with outside eyes. Ideas, and particularly the ideas of the American Revolution and the American founding, structure and inform American society in a way that I think is very, very different to even other Anglosphere countries like Australia. So, as you know, in Australia, when we talk about all sorts of questions, you don't have people constantly going back to Henry Parkes or constantly going back to debates that were going on at the constitutional conventions in the 1890s. Believe you me, in America, they absolutely do. This is constantly brought up all the time. And it doesn't matter whether you're on the right or on the left. I think the left basically want to get rid of all that. But those reference points are so strong that even the left can't quite detach themselves from all that. So I think America is, in many respects, a country that is deeply informed by this particular set of ideas. An American historian named Gordon Wood, who's a progressive, self-described progressive, wrote a very good book recently talking about just how deeply these ideas define what it means to be American. So that's the first thing. Second thing, however, I would also say is that there is a sense of national identity in America that goes beyond just the ideas and principles of the American founding. Whether it's things like a pride in the achievement of America in facing down National Socialism and defeating Nazis and communism, whether it's things like attachment to particular parts of the country. A lot of Americans have a great deal of attachment to their town, to their region, to their state. It's not the same everywhere, but there are degrees of attachment which I think are very much real, that people associate with their family and with their upbringing, etc. People in America are still, for the most part, I would argue, Americans are still a relatively religious people compared to a lot of other Western countries. I mean, church attendance and synagogue attendance is much higher still in America than in a lot of other Western countries. But I would also say that in terms of identity, so there are those specific identities, but there is also a sense, I think, that in America, at least among a big plurality of Americans, that America represents part of what I will unhesitantly call Western civilization. And this Western civilization is something that took root and form in America and took on a particular character in America, but it's not something that was created fully in America. It goes back to the Greeks, to the Romans, to the Jewish prophets, to all these things.
American foundation, I mean, they revere their founding fathers, like Catholics revere their saints, right? It's an odd phenomenon, this Protestant nation, essentially. But it was formed at the height of Enlightenment liberalism in the late 18th century. Whereas Australia, I like to think, when we were founded as a nation, we were founded at the end of the 19th century, where some of the promises of that whole Cobden, Bright, end of the British Empire, Pax Britannia, needed to be readjusted. So we sort of have, our foundation is a much more hard-nosed approach in some ways to the establishment.
It's actually pretty Benthamite, I think.
Yeah. But I mean, we had, and we had real different challenges.
Yes.
Because of our location and our size. And so, sometimes I think there's a tendency to run down Australia and its foundation because we weren't, espousing Jeffersonian type of declarations on this, that, and the other. But in some ways, it was no less an achievement in many ways. So anyway, I've taken a lot of your time, but I really appreciate Sam and continue to. Where can people find out more about the work that you do? And
I'd suggest they simply go to the place I work, the American Institute for Economic Research, AIER.org. And you'll find about my work, a lot about my work, but also the work of my colleagues and what we're trying to do in terms of advancing the idea of markets, limited government, and many of these cultural things that we've been talking about today.
In the new environment. Yeah, really appreciate it. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me.